China is not comfortable with the idea of replacing the concept of Asia Pacific with Indo-Pacific. I think there is greater cognizance inside the US, within Washington, D.C., that they cannot repeat, the binaries of, being with the US or against the US or choosing between the US or China. India looks at itself as an important actor in the region within the Indo-Pacific. It wants to be one of the stakeholders, but not the stakeholder. India does not want to completely shun away Russia. I do feel that, yes, with this war, Russia is worse off on every aspect, and it may not be considered the most dependable supplier, even from India's point of view. The West does look at India as a counterweight, and it wants India to balance China in the region. India does not want to become a pawn between two countries which are competing against each other strategically.
Hello and welcome to Infer Talks, where we bring you some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. My guest today is someone who has written 2 books on matters related to Indo-Pacific, US, China, and India. She happens to be an emerging authority on the region, and she is someone who's from India, but is based right now in Canada. My guest today, you've guessed it right, she is Dr. Aditi Malhotra. Dr. Aditi, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Osama. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Let us start our conversation from this very first question that I think is very important. Until only a few years ago, the term Indo-Pacific was largely absent from geopolitical forums. And yet today, we see this as one of the regular terms being thrown about in areas of international affairs. And we've seen countries like United States, India, United Kingdom, France, Philippines, and South Korea, adopt their respective policies on the region itself. So could you go ahead and do us the honor in terms of explaining what the term Indo-Pacific is all about?
For sure. Thank you so much. And I think that's a very relevant question. So, yeah, you're right when you say that, we always had the term Asia Pacific before. It's only in the last, say, 10, 15 years that we've started, the usage of Indo-Pacific. And this clearly, indicates a change in how the world and a lot of countries actually perceive the specific region. So let me start from the basic. So what is the Indo-Pacific region and what is this concept? So it's actually a geopolitical area which spans between 2 regions of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So it would not be wrong to say it's a very fairly new geopolitical construct. And of course, every country has a nuanced perception of how they look at this region. So largely a lot of countries perceive it to be stretching from the west coast of the United States to the west coast of India. For India, the Indo-Pacific stretches from the east coast of Africa to Oceania. Okay, so again, there are nuances on how different countries look at this region, but largely the whole idea of Indo-Pacific acknowledges the rise of Asia, because previously it was perceived that the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific region are 2 different areas of, arenas of strategic operation and perception. But with the rise of China, with the rise of India, and with greater interconnectedness between the developments of these regions, which effectively means what happens in the Pacific will have implications for the Indian Ocean region broadly, and events in the Indian Ocean region are, of course, bound to influence developments and the strategic landscape of the Pacific region as well. So the Indo-Pacific is like one strategic arena and a different mental map of different countries. And it, of course, has a lot of sub-regions within that. There is the east coast of Africa, there's the Indian Ocean region, the Southeast Asia countries, you have the Pacific Island nations, the west coast of the US, and Oceania. So you have these sub-regions, and each of these regions have different ways of looking at the broader region. But if you club everything together, it would not be, it would not be wrong to call it a single strategic arena, which is the Indo-Pacific.
Aditi, we really thank you for, walking us through that really expansive definition of the region itself. But let me bring you another perspective to it. Countries like, for example, China, which have actually taken exception and have actually shown a lot of reluctance to the use of the term itself. And with that reluctance, you also see that inhibition to approach issues through the use of that policy framework. What does that really tell us about China, and how does it really view some of these developments in that region?
So that's a great point that you make, Osama. And you're right when you say that there are countries which take exception to this concept of Indo-Pacific. And naturally, China has to be one of them. And why is that so? So if anyone is calling or referring to a specific region as the Indo-Pacific, they're largely referring to it as a single strategic area, wherein there's greater coordination between the regional countries on a number of issues, whether it's economic, whether it's traditional and non-traditional security issues. But for China, the whole idea and the concept of Indo-Pacific is regarded as a ploy to contain China and its rise. And if you actually look at it, it is in direct conflict with the whole vision of China, the whole Belt and Road Initiative, and the whole vision, because that kind of talks about bringing together China, the Central Asian countries, and Southeast Asia. So they're talking about a different stretch, which is kind of in direct clash with the Indo-Pacific concept of being another single strategic area. So it is the clash between these two visions. And of course, China is not comfortable with the idea of replacing the concept of Asia Pacific with Indo-Pacific, because there are a lot of US allies and partners which are embracing this. And it's, of course, a direct challenge to China because they perceive this as a region to be an anti-Chinese construct. And at the same time, these countries which embrace the Indo-Pacific are somehow looking to shape the region wherein China does not dominate, wherein there is not like a single actor dominating. So of course, this is in conflict with how China perceives the region. And naturally, it is opposed to the concept then.
So moving on to our next question, Aditi. So on the contrary, while the US has shown a renewed strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific, many would call it lacking when it comes to what the countries in the region are looking for: functional benefits, or may I say quote unquote functional benefits, such as economic assistance, developmental partnership, trade, and connectivity, things that China is willing to provide. Do you think the US can successfully achieve its objectives in the region without offering such benefits?
So that's an interesting question. And before I actually answer that, I want to kind of give you a brief background on, this whole competition between US and China on offering security versus economic benefits.
Mhm.
So of course, if you just look at how the world was, after the Cold War, the US was a unipolar actor, right? It was dominating not just in terms of security provisions. It was kind of acting as the global security actor, but at the same time also an economic partner to a lot of countries, whether they were in Asia or other regions. What happened over time was, as China became a stronger economic actor, it started replacing the US as a favorable and an important economic partner to almost a lot of these countries. As a result, what the countries were doing, they were trying to benefit from both sides. So, in the security aspect, a lot of countries, again, not all, but a lot of countries were comfortable with US providing that security protection. And at the same time, they were happy to, engage with China when it comes to economic relationships. And that is where the US kind of, slacked. It wasn't doing really good as an economic partner. So when the whole Indo-Pacific construct came up and, there were strategies coming up from different countries, there has been a continued criticism of the US, exactly making the point that you do, that there are a lot of aspects that China can, deliver upon, whether it is, offering cheap infrastructure, whether it's giving, economic, like supply chain integration. So if you look at those aspects, yes, China does have an advantage when it comes to that. But at the same time, even the US has focused more on the security aspect, in the recent times, it has realized that it needs to come up even as an economic actor, which is why in May 2022, we saw the US come up with the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, which included, 13 partners, actually almost including 40% of the global GDP. and it focuses on the resilience of supply chains, inclusivity, high standards of labor rights, sustainability in terms of the climate change. And they're looking for partners, and they're making it a flexible framework. So there are more and more actors willing to coordinate with the US, even on the economic front. So yes, of course, China has an advantage, but at the same time, the US is trying to, play the game in the right manner.
So do you think for the US to, bring about some of those functional benefits on the table, wouldn't it have to sort of pepper its strategy with building back a better world? And don't you think that a strategy which is more focused on choosing sides when it comes to, having the states to approach their policy in the coming years or in perhaps coming decades?
Yeah, I do agree that yes, there is greater need to include more non-security and non-military defense related aspects in the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think that is something that DC has been trying to do of late, which is why we see them getting relatively more involved in having an economic framework and offering, an alternative to regional actors vis-a-vis China as an economic partner, as a security actor, and in all these aspects as well. At the same time, I think there is greater cognizance inside the US, within Washington, D.C., that they cannot repeat, the binaries of, being with the US or against the US, or choosing between the US or China when it comes to interacting and dealing with regional actors. They do realize that the US will need to offer more than what it has offered so far, but at the same time, do not push these countries and force them to take a particular side. So I see that as a positive development, but at the same time, this is work in progress for sure.
So, Aditi, in your recent book, Understanding Security Role of Evolution of US, China, and India, you've actually spoken about India being under this expectation to assume the role of the next net security provider. But on the other hand, what we see is that, India has traditionally guarded, jealously guarded, in fact, its tradition of non-aligned status. How do you see India being able to sort of shift away from that policy and be able to, adopt and assume this new role, while then at the same time, in your previous book, and this is your different book, where you've actually identified, different characteristics and dispositions that actually create those limitations or gaps for India to meet those newer expectations as a net security provider. So where do you see India would be able to play that role in a more pragmatic manner then?
For sure. So see, there's a lot in this question. So I'll start unpacking from, say, the
Sure.
past. Okay. So of course, if you're looking at India, okay, India's history during the Cold War, and that's also, been even before that, India's always, as you said, jealously guarded, it's what a lot of people call a strategic autonomy when it comes to this region, wherein they've not wanted foreign actors and foreign security players getting involved in the waters or in the areas nearby India. And of course, this is a different India that we see today. So when you say that, how would India shift away from that? I guess India's already shifted away from that. So if you look at, the 90s and before the 90s, India was wary because of its own inability to kind of dominate or, be a predominant maritime actor, say, in the Indian Ocean region. But as India's economic rise has given it the resources, and there's greater maritime awakening within India, what it has done is that it has made New Delhi more confident about cooperating and interacting with a lot of foreign players in these areas which India considers as traditional areas of interests. So of course, that shift has already happened, and that is ongoing at the same time. Now, the second question that you say is that, of course, a lot of actors want India to presume a bigger role. Some of them want India to act as a balance to China in the region. Some of them want India to be a net provider of security or a net security provider. Both the terms have been used. And of course, these are external perceptions. Some aspects of these external perceptions are accepted and embraced by India, but not all. So for India looks at itself as an important actor in the region within the Indo-Pacific. It wants to be one of the stakeholders, but not the stakeholder. But when it comes to the Indian Ocean region, of course, India wants to be a dominant security actor, but of course, at the same time, it wants to avoid taking on more responsibilities than it can effectively manage at a particular point in time. And again, going back to your other aspect, wherein you say that there are challenges which kind of make India, it makes it challenging for India to go ahead and actually effectively play these many roles that it wants to, or what external actors wanted to play. There are discrepancies in some of these aspects, and a lot of these discrepancies come from domestic factors, and some of them come from international factors. So I know this will be long, but I'll just need to explain some aspects of this. So as India has emerged, right, and there is greater financial resource and fiscal benefits that India has incurred, which has allowed it to become a much more dominant security actor. But at the same time, it is still a developing country which has limited resources. Now, with limited resources and rising security concerns, there is a continued, dilemma about how do you cater to all these new security challenges with the limited resources that you have. And at the same time, even though India has awakened as a maritime actor, its priorities are still very continental. It's still dominant when it comes to the land aspects, the land border disputes, whether it's with Pakistan or whether it's with China. These aspects still take away a lot of India's primary, efforts and diplomatic energies. And even that, has an effect. So these are some of the challenges which do exist. And at the same time, when India is interacting with external actors, there are areas of convergences and there are areas of divergences. So it's not that everything's hunky-dory, whether it's even with the US or other actors. So there is always some sort of discrepancy, because of which, India is sometimes able to be a very effective actor, but sometimes not as effective as it would want it to be, or how some external actors would want it to be.
So, Aditi, when you said when India is expected to play as more of an effective actor, and then at the same time, you're drawing on to these internal domestic incoherences that do exist within India with respect to, having a more strategic recalibration onto maritime affairs than what it currently has. What would it really take for India to actually make that shift? Or do you think that shift perhaps may not occur, or it may not be realistic to expect of India to be making that shift? What would you say on that?
So I always generally maintain that when it comes to strategic interests, it's rare that you would see a country playing in black and white colors. There will always be shades of gray in that. So yes, there has been a shift towards the maritime aspect, as I said, but at the same time, there are continental priorities that New Delhi faces. So I do not think there would be a complete either or situation wherein India gives up its priorities of land borders and just focuses on the maritime. I think what India would do and what it's working towards is kind of having a healthy balance, and a happy mix between its different security concerns, whether they're external, whether they're maritime in nature or land-based. I think it's all about how they're looking to distribute the limited resources that they have towards these varying concerns. And of course, it's trying to partner with a lot of other countries. So it's not that India has to do everything on its own or wants to do everything on its own. This is where I think having partnerships with a lot of other actors which share India's security concerns is going to play a very key aspect and a key role.
So you spoke of, practicing along or more largely and broadly within that gray zone. I want to ask you another question, and that has to do with events in the wake of, Russia-Ukraine war, and how India has sort of, once again played that very complicated, delicate balancing act, where it has continued to import oil and then at the same time continued its military partnership with Russia, which sort of is under discussion right now, that whether it wants to recalibrate it or not. Do you see that, despite what we've seen after the war, do you see any kind of significant reduction in terms of India's reliance on Russia?
So when it comes to India's reliance on Russia, of course, the most dominant aspect is the defense relations. And I would need to give a bit of background on this aspect. So it was, mostly during the Cold War when India acted as a non-aligned actor and it did not want to squaringly take sides either with the US or the USSR. That is when India and the Soviet Union's historical ties, grew stronger.
Yes.
And one of the main aspect was, of course, there was economic, cooperation, there was diplomatic coordination, but at the same time, it was the military, cooperation which really helped India, because the Soviet Union and even Russia, for that matter, has been offering affordable prices for weapon systems. It has been very much willing to supply advanced technology, which India could not receive from any other partners or the West. There were a lot of opportunities for co-production and for technology transfer. And these things have, of course, made India dependent on the Soviet Union or Russia to a level wherein almost 70% of India's defense systems are either Soviet origin or Russian origin. However, having said that, after 2000s, we actually see India trying to diversify, its military aspects and defense cooperation relations with a lot of countries. And between 2017 and 2021, India kind of lowered its dependency on the Russia, the military dependency, by almost 23%. And the focus largely shifted towards producing indigenous, weapon systems and going domestic on those aspects. But even then, during the same period, India was still 46% dependent on Russia, whether it's for spare parts or for, new deals. So this has always stayed so. And what is, apart from the fact that India has been needing Russia because there is an ongoing, almost an active standoff with China and with China. So, of course, military preparedness for India does become a priority at this stage. Having said that, as I said, the dependency has been lowering. But the problem is India does not want to completely shun away Russia, also because it is scared that if it comes under the Chinese orbit and becomes a junior player, or a junior brother, if you will, to China, that goes against India's security interests, strategic interests, and all type of interests. So this is something.
So don't you think would that create some kind of an inhibition in future for Russia on, say, behest of China to provide with necessary supplies that India may need in a given time? Or do you think the partnership that exists between Russia and India would perhaps, would be able to survive that difficult patch if it were to be confronted?
So that's a very, very good question. Personally, I do think that, while we may talk about the fact that, hey, what if Russia stops supplying things to India because China says so? I think the bigger fear is if Russia will be capable as a supplier of arms and weapon systems, because I think one of the biggest priority for Russia after this war, or even during the war, is about rearming themselves. I think their priorities are now going to be more domestic in nature, wherein they want to first focus on getting their military right, as opposed to supplying military systems to other countries. Having said that, Russia is trying hard, and a lot of ongoing projects have not been shelved between India and Russia. We do see a lot of cooperation even now, whether it's in terms of energy or whether it's in terms of military supplies. But I do feel that yes, with this war, Russia is worse off on every aspect, and it may not be considered the most dependable supplier, even from India's point of view. And in the medium and long term, I see India kind of becoming lesser and lesser dependent on Russia. And sadly, I do feel that Russia is likely to get closer to China, acting as a junior, as a junior player and not as an equal in their partnership. And this will clearly not be something that India desires. But it is what it is. So I do not think, but yes, I do feel, talking to some of the people in India, that India is looking at ways to diversify and start looking more towards the West, towards, say, Israel and all these countries, but at the same time also focus on indigenization of their own, on their own industry.
Yeah. But Aditi, the question that I really wanted to ask here, and I think it would still be relevant to ask you, though you've sort of like answered my question. Recently we've seen reports of India and Russia, enter in this collaboration to co-manufacture assault rifles for Indian Army. And then at the same time, we've seen traditional partnership between the two countries in production of, say, BrahMos cruise missile. And then at the same time, India has also been procuring S-400, ballistic missile defense system from Russia. How do you then say or come to this conclusion that, that partnership is perhaps, reconfiguring itself when in fact we see the evidence to the contrary?
So I'm not saying it's reconfiguring itself to a level wherein India would not be a partner to Russia. I'm just saying that the dependency on Russia is going to lower, even as there are. So a lot of these deals that you talk about, they're not recent deals, right? They have been deals which have been signed in the past. As a result of that, these are ongoing. And to be very frank, from India's point of view, they want these deals to go through because it obviously has a direct implication for India's own military preparedness at this stage. And that is a priority, especially if it's actually, kind of trying to counter Chinese activities along the line of actual control. So in these aspects, of course, India wants those deals to go on. But as I said, I'm not saying that Russia would be completely irrelevant. I'm just saying that India's dependency on Russia will go down because of Russia's own inability to perhaps, offer what it has offered in the past. That becomes a question because Russia is not doing very well in terms of its own military or in terms of its military industrial complex. So I think it will lower, it will not completely snap away.
Okay, Aditi. So then at the same time, we're seeing that India is viewed as a counterweight in the region to China by the West, with India expecting to deepen this relationship. What does rising competition between the US and China bode for India? And do you see it being able to balance these conflicting ambitions?
Before I actually answer this, yes, the West does look at India as a counterweight and it wants India to balance China in the region. But this is exactly what India does not want. It does not, want to be as, viewed as a counterweight. It does not want to be viewed as a balancer. And this is something which is very evident in all of India's speeches on the Indo-Pacific region, starting, even when it was the Asia Pacific. If you actually look at all the speeches of all the Indian officials, one thing they've stood against is the whole idea of putting India into the box of a balancer. And
But
this
then
is
why
something
is that, Aditi? Why is that?
because India considers that a trap. Because India does not want to become a pawn between two countries which are competing against each other strategically. For India, the idea is to have and secure and maximize its own security and national interests. It does not want to, become a part of, hey, you have to choose this country or that country. Frankly, it wants to maximize its interest in a manner wherein it can gain from both the aspects and from both the countries and both the sides on that aspect. And of course, India wants to avoid that binary. Let me give you an example. So even when India had like a standoff with China, right? At the same time, so you would presume that India would snap its, relationships with China on a lot of forums, which it did not do. It was still, joining the Russia, India, China trilateral and discussing things. India is still one of the largest borrowers from, the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Bank. And if you actually look at these things, what India is doing is trying to carve its own path in a manner where it does not become a balancer, if you will. It wants to be an important stakeholder in the region. It wants to play a very dominant role, but it wants a multipolar world. It does not want a bipolar world. And it wants to be one of those crucial poles in a multipolar setting globally.
Right. So, Aditi, if I could rephrase it another way, Are you suggesting that India wants to have its cake and eat it too, or are you trying to say that India wants to perhaps, lessen its costs versus the benefits that it can actually gain out of these collaborations with the West?
So you're right when you say that is India trying to maximize its interests and minimize the costs and risks? Yes, I think that's what not just India, but all the countries are trying to do at this point in time. So what India is actually doing is trying to carve a place for itself wherein it can, cooperate with the West on areas of convergences and, not and deal and manage the areas of divergences, but at the same time when it comes to non-Western countries or other countries, including even China for that matter, it is okay to cooperate with them on aspects of convergences and deal with the areas of divergences, whether it's having a military problem, which we see between India and China. India is willing to go that path, but the question is, the whole idea of not taking one side and trying to balance all the sides and kind of playing on the fence, if you will. I think the question is how sustainable that is. Because the bigger question is during the non-alignment era, right, during the Cold War, India was able to kind of balance between, okay, I think balance is a wrong word, trying to maximize its interests while trying to balance the US and the USSR. It could do that more effectively because the USSR did not pose any security challenge to India. What's different now is that if India really has to kind of maximize its interests, one of the actors, in this case China, is actually a security threat to India with an ongoing territorial problem. So I think that is what complicates the whole calculation for India, and which is why I personally wonder how sustainable that is. But as I said, everything would be about the trade-offs, the cost benefit analysis when it comes to how India is going to deal between the West and China on that aspect.
So, Aditi, before I come to my last two questions, you mentioned something that, India is actually trying to do what nearly all other countries do, and that is to basically, maximize its interests and make sure that, it is not bleeding in the process or, it's not maximizing its costs at the cost of its benefits. So, are you suggesting that India has successfully popularized the non alignment movement across the world, as you see so many other countries in Asia probably harp on the same tune that they do not want to align to any great power in this competition, either it be the United States or China?
So that's a very interesting question. And I personally feel that while a lot of people would like to believe that India's popularized the whole non alignment thing, but frankly, what India is really doing is not following non alignment, but more so following issue based alignment. And this is, a term which has been used by the Indian government, where they're trying to, align or partner with different countries based on the specific issue, based on cost benefit analysis, and not really trying to stay away from the complete strategic game that is ongoing. And I think a lot of other countries would want to do the same because they are trying to benefit from what, because not every secondary country or a smaller country always has the kind of agency in international relations. I'm not saying they don't, but not to the kind of the degree of agency which say a country like India may have. So based on where they sit in the complete hierarchy, I think every country is trying to have issue based alignment, whether it is with the US or China. But again, I would repeat, the question for India is how sustainable would this be in the long term? So right now it may look like it's going successfully, but the question is in the long term, with China posing a constant security threat to India, how would India continue to kind of balance in a manner where it does not pick a side but try to maximize itself? So I think it's an interesting diplomatic line that India has taken, and it is following kind of the course of history that is followed previously, but it's very interesting to see how things go from here.
So, finally, coming on to South Asia and with our particular focus on India and its relations with bordering countries, do you think improving key relations with countries it shares a border with is going to play a key role? We've seen historically turbulent relations with Pakistan and increasingly fraught relations with Nepal, and more significantly, in terms of strategic direction vis a vis China. Do you think friction with its neighbors will be a key challenge for India and its ambitions?
You're right when you say that India has historically, dealt with this challenge, and frankly, India will continue to deal with this challenge because with China's rise, the countries which are India's neighbors have always tried to, try to balance between India and China in a manner that again, is maximizing their interests in the region. So of course, Pakistan has always remained like, looking at, India Pakistan's fraught relations for like decades now. China's always, the whole China Pakistan military partnership and strategic partnership has always remained a challenge for India. And of course, Nepal also continues to become a challenge, with China getting more involved in the South Asian region. So, yes, this is a challenge. Having said that, I think there is greater cognizance in India that this challenge is not likely to go, like this will persist. So what India is trying to do is trying to diversify away, from the construct of South Asia, and is trying to embrace a larger region of, the broader Indian Ocean region or the Indo-Pacific, which is why you see India getting into, different frameworks, whether it is the BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, whether it is I2U2, which is, UAE, Israel, India, US. What India is trying to do is diversify away from the region in a manner that it can engage other actors, which may sometimes be its immediate neighbor and sometimes not. So it's trying to embrace the extended neighborhood because it understands that the South Asian challenge vis-a-vis, Pakistan, or when it comes to Nepal, will likely stay. That's unlikely to go.
Aditi, you made a very fair point, but if we look at other regions, like for example, Southeast Asia and Europe, they have actually based or reconfigured their entire relationship on promoting connectivity and integration within their own region. And we've seen it fairly, examples from within the region that I may not quote, but perhaps, we've seen that such approaches have not exactly worked when we've tried to look away from the region. So let me also take the liberty to ask you about Pakistan and India relations. Both countries have been able to maintain the ceasefire along the line of control for the past 2 years now. But we see little progress otherwise, and both sides moving forward in the next 2 years. And do you see any scope or is there any hope of progress through pursuing low hanging fruits in bilateral relations?
Okay, now that's an interesting question, and I'll start with the whole aspect of connectivity.
Hmm.
I think that is one aspect wherein, of course, South Asia lacks considerably. We have seen that, there's extreme lack of connectivity, whether it is between India and Pakistan, which is of course, affected by how the two countries have been, in conflicts and wars. So it's always the security and strategic challenges which take over any preference that any side may have when it comes to connectivity. But at the same time, India, through BIMSTEC, and when it comes to other countries towards the Southeast Asian region, India is trying to actually make some sort of connectivity with those regions, if not, towards the north of its borders, whether, it's with Pakistan and other aspects. So India is trying to work on those aspects, but I think it is work in progress. I would not say that India has done very well, but yes, it is looking at that. But again, on, towards the east and not towards like the immediate neighbor, if you will. But having said that, when it comes to India-Pakistan relations, yes, it is, I think one of the positive aspect is that they have maintained a ceasefire, but I do not see much changing. I see that the trajectory that we've seen over these recent years will actually continue in a manner wherein I think that what Indian government has realized or feels is that they understand that there are huge challenges to dealing with Pakistan because everything gets overshadowed by, the security considerations from both sides. So what India is doing is trying to diversify away from Pakistan and not really making like Pakistan as a dominant issue when it comes to its strategic calculations. And I'm not saying that Pakistan is irrelevant because it's impossible to become irrelevant. India will continue to deal with Pakistan the way it has. And as I said, I do not see much change happening. I do not see, India or Pakistan actually working on any low-hanging fruits in the coming years. But if there's a change of direction, of course, things can change overnight. But I feel that the current trajectory is likely to continue in the coming years.
On this point, we both can agree to disagree. And I think that perhaps while you certainly have your point in terms of, India having to look on other regions outside of South Asia or perhaps, away from Pakistan, I still think that, until or unless some kind of headway is not made between these two great South Asian nations, I see that, there's going to be little progress for South Asia itself. Thank you, Aditi, for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Osama, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Dr. Aditi Malhotra. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you would like to stay informed on our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.